The desert had a way of talking at night, whispering through the dry grass and hollow trees like a ghost that never learned to rest. On the edge of that silence stood the Reeves Ranch, one lonely flame burning inside the bunkhouse where Clayton Reeves sat cleaning his Winchester rifle. His face was carved from years of sun and dust, and his eyes gray, steady, and tired watched the fire as if it might confess something. He wasn't expecting company, not this late, not from the desert. But the sound of soft footsteps on his porch told him the night had other plans. The door opened without a knock, and two Apache sisters stepped in dusty, proud and silent, like spirits shaped from wind and moonlight. The taller one met his gaze without fear. "We seek warmth," she said, her voice low but firm, "and maybe food, if you have enough to share." Clayton hesitated. Memories of old blood feuds and broken treaties flickering in the back of his mind. Yet something in the younger ones is gentle, uncertain. "Fire's for anyone who needs it," he muttered. They sat near the hearth, eating slow, cautious bites of beans and cornbread. The older watched him with quiet calculation. The younger kept stealing glances, as if measuring the kind of man he was. Outside, the wind rose, sweeping across the plains like a song of warning. Inside, the fire's glow painted them all in gold and shadow. Clayton leaned back, pretending to yawn. "You two can take the cot," he said. "I'll rest here by the fire." He lay down, hat low, rifle near his hand. But he didn't sleep. Years on the frontier had taught him to trust the stillness between sounds, and now that stillness was heavy with meaning. He waited, listened. Then came the whisper, soft, in Apache at first, then broken English. "He's the one," said the older sister, her tone cold as the river stones. "The man from the river, are you sure?" the younger asked, trembling. "We saw the mark on his saddle," came the reply. "It's him, the one who killed our father." Clayton's chest tightened, breath slow, eyes frozen beneath his hat brim. The words felt like the click of a hammer in the dark. The older sister whispered again, "Before dawn, it ends. He dies, and the river runs clear again." The younger hesitated. "He fed us, gave us warmth. What if the stories were wrong?" But the answer came like a blade. "The debt is the debt." The rancher's pulse thudded against the floorboards as he lay there, unmoving, the truth of his past pressing down like the desert sky. Outside, coyotes cried into the wind. Inside, the fire cracked once, casting their shadows long and thin across the walls. Whatever brought those sisters here tonight wasn't chance, it was vengeance. And by the time the first light touched the horizon, Clayton Reeves knew he'd have to face the ghosts he thought he'd buried in the sand. Morning came slow and gold over the Reeves Ranch, stretching light across the cold boards of the bunkhouse. Clayton Reeves hadn't slept a wink. He lay there listening to the soft rhythm of breathing from the cot where the two Apache sisters rested, their faces calm in sleep, like the night's whispers had been nothing more than dreams. But he knew what he'd heard. Their words still rang in his skull, "The man from the river. The one who killed our father." He sat up quietly, poured himself a cup of cold coffee, and stared through the dusty window at the horizon. Out there, the world looked innocent, sunlight spilling over the red mesas, hawks circling above the river bend. But Clayton knew the land had a memory. It remembered every drop of blood spilled on its dirt, and his boots had left their share of stains. He thought back to a summer 10 years ago, a dry season when cattle rustlers roamed the borderlands. There had been Apache riders, fast and merciless, and one gunfight by the river that ended in smoke and screams. He'd pulled the trigger that day more than once. Maybe he hadn't known who he killed. Maybe he had. Now it didn't matter. The past had come for its due. Behind him, the sound of quiet movement pulled him back. The sisters were awake. The older one, with sharp eyes and a stare that cut through silence, stood near the door. The younger, her hair unbound and face soft with doubt, lingered by the fire. "We thank you," the older said flatly. "We'll be on our way." Clayton nodded slowly, watching them gather their things. "You heading far?" he asked. "Far enough," she replied. He could feel the tension like a storm before lightning her every word, careful. Her hand never far from the knife at her waist. The younger one looked at him once more before stepping out into the sunlight. For a heartbeat, her gaze softened. "The river runs east," she murmured, as if it meant something he should remember. Then they were gone, walking toward the horizon, the desert swallowing their footprints, one grain at a time. Clayton stood there, heart heavy, mind burning. He didn't know whether to follow them or run the other way. Every instinct told him to let it go, to ride out to the canyon. Forget they ever came, but something deeper, something heavy with guilt, told him he couldn't. He strapped on his gun belt, slung the Winchester over his shoulder, and whistled for his horse. As he mounted up, the morning wind carried a faint echo from the valley below, the cry of a hawk, the whisper of water, and something else, something human, a woman's voice, distant but clear. "The blood debt must be paid." Clayton froze. The words rolled through him like thunder through the canyon. He turned his horse toward the east, toward the river. The past was waiting, and this time there'd be no pretending to sleep. The river hadn't changed, not in 10 long years. It still wound through the desert like a silver scar, whispering to the cottonwoods and carrying secrets only ghosts could understand. Clayton Reeves rode along its bank with the sun high behind him, dust rising around his horse's hooves in lazy curls. The land was quiet, too quiet, just the hum of cicadas and the memory of gunfire in his ears. Every bend of that river carried a story, and he could almost see the past painted in the water, the smoke, the shouting. The moment a younger version of himself had raised his rifle against shapes he barely recognized. He remembered the day like a fever dream, Apache riders, dust-streaked and fierce, coming fast across the shallows, and him firing until the world went still. He'd told himself it was survival, that war didn't ask questions. But now, 10 years later, the ghosts had finally found their way home, in the form of 2 sisters, with eyes full of judgment and sorrow. As he rode, he found the trail's small, careful footprints following the river east. He dismounted, crouched low, and studied them. The younger sister's steps were light, uneven, as though she'd hesitated. The elder's prints were straight and sure, like a soldier's. They were heading toward the canyon, sacred Apache ground, where few white men ever came back from. Clayton straightened up, dusted off his knees, and looked at the horizon. "Guess I'll find out if the river remembers me," he muttered. The wind answered with a long sigh, rustling the reeds. By afternoon, he reached the canyon mouth. Red cliffs rose high on both sides, narrow and sun-baked, and the river ran thinner here, slower, darker. The air felt heavy, full of the kind of silence that lives inside old places. As Clayton led his horse through the narrow pass, something shifted, a shadow moving against the rock. Then came a soft voice, sharp with warning. "You shouldn't have come." He turned. The younger sister stood on a ridge above, her bow drawn, the sunlight catching in her hair. "We didn't want more blood," she said, her tone trembling. "But my sister, she believes the spirits won't rest until yours does." Clayton's throat tightened. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "That day by the river, I didn't know who they were." Her eyes softened, but not enough to forgive. "You should tell her," she whispered, "before she lets the past kill the present." Then she vanished into the rocks like a ghost fading into the wind. Clayton stood there, heart pounding, staring at the river that glimmered like a mirror to his sins. Somewhere ahead, the older sister was waiting, and the desert had begun to remember everything he'd tried so hard to forget. The sun was sliding low when Clayton reached the heart of the canyon, where the river split around a cluster of ancient stones carved by time and prayer. The air there felt different, heavy with stories, thick with ghosts. Every rock, every whisper of wind carried the weight of something sacred. His horse snorted uneasily, hooves shifting on the gravel, as if it too could feel the invisible eyes watching from the cliffs. Clayton dismounted, his boots crunching against the earth, and he stood still for a long moment, letting the silence swallow him whole. Then, from the shadows beyond the river bend, the older Apache sister stepped out. She wore her hair braided tight, a necklace of white bone around her neck, and in her eyes burned the cold fire of memory. She said nothing at first, only looked at him the way someone looks at a storm before deciding whether to stand or run. Finally, her voice broke the silence, low, sharp, and steady. "You remember this place?" she asked. Clayton's jaw tightened. "I remember too much," he said, "and not enough." She took a step closer, her moccasins soundless on the dirt. "My father died here. My brother, too. You killed them." The words hit him like a hammer, and for a moment the canyon spun. "I didn't know," he managed. "It was a raid. Smoke everywhere. I couldn't tell who was who." She stared hard at him. "But you pulled the trigger." Clayton's throat burned. He nodded once. "I did." The wind sighed between the cliffs like a dying man. The sister's hand moved slowly toward the knife at her belt, her voice trembling with rage and grief. "The river remembers Blood Rancher. It calls for balance." Clayton didn't move. He looked at her, not as an enemy, but as a reflection of everything the frontier had broken: families, peace, the line between right and wrong. "If killing me will bring your father rest," he said softly, "then I won't stop you." She froze. The knife quivered in her hand. For a long, heavy moment, neither moved, just the sound of water trickling between them and the echo of the past in the canyon walls. Then came another voice, fragile and breathless, from behind. "Sister, don't." The younger Apache stepped out from the shadows, tears streaking her face. "He didn't lie. I asked the river. The spirits showed me. It was the soldiers, not him." The older one turned sharply. "You saw?" The younger nodded, trembling. "He saved our mother once, before the war began." The silence that followed was deep enough to break a heart. Clayton lowered his gaze, too tired to defend himself, too hollow to hope. The older sister's hand fell from the knife, her breath shaking as she whispered, "Then the debt is not his." The canyon exhaled, as if the land itself had been holding its breath. The river murmured softly between the rocks, and the sun dipped behind the cliffs, turning everything to gold and shadow. Clayton looked at the two sisters, the ghosts of his sins staring back at him, and knew that whatever peace this moment brought, it had been bought with lifetimes of pain. The light in the canyon softened as the last of the sun slipped behind the cliffs, painting the river in gold and shadow. For the first time in hours, no one spoke. Clayton Reeves stood still, hat in hand, the wind tugging gently at his coat. Across the river, the two Apache sisters faced him, one trembling with tears, the other frozen between vengeance and mercy. The older sister's hand still hovered near the knife at her side, but her grip had loosened. The younger one's voice, though quiet, lingered in the air like a prayer. "The spirits said his hands are not the ones that took our father." The canyon held its breath, the sound of the river whispering through the stones like the voice of the dead. Clayton felt the weight of the years pressing on him, every scar, every battle, every mistake carved deep into his bones. "If I could trade my years to bring him back, I would," he said softly. "But all I have left to give is truth." He took a slow step forward, boots sinking into the mud. "That day I was a fool, chasing orders and fear. I saw faces, not people. I saw shadows, not hearts. I didn't see the man you lost. Until now." The older sister's eyes glimmered in the fading light, her anger trembling like a candle in wind. She looked at the river, then at the sky, as though seeking permission from the ghosts who watched. Her voice cracked. "You carry his memory now," she said. "Every breath you take is what he can't. That is your debt." Clayton bowed his head. "Then I'll carry it till the river forgets my name." The younger sister stepped closer, her voice breaking. "The river doesn't forget, but it forgives." The words hung in the twilight like smoke from a dying fire. The older one finally sheathed her knife and turned away, shoulders trembling under the weight of something heavier than hate. "Go, rancher," she whispered. "Leave this canyon. The past will rest here." For a moment, the world seemed to exhale. The wind softened. The birds fell silent. Clayton stood there, staring at the place where so much pain had lived, and for the first time in years, he felt the earth beneath him ease. As he mounted his horse and turned toward the west, the younger sister's voice drifted through the canyon one last time, gentle as the river itself. "The land remembers, but it no longer bleeds." The words followed him down the trail, carried by the evening wind, and Clayton Reeves rode on, a man forgiven but never free, disappearing slowly into the dusk as the river whispered behind him, washing the blood from its stones and carrying it toward a gentler tomorrow. The desert evening stretched wide and quiet, the sky painted in deep purples and fading golds, as Clayton Reeves rode west along the slow-breathing river. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust, and somewhere far behind him, the canyon whispered its last goodbye. He didn't look back. Some places weren't meant to be revisited, not by the living. The hooves of his horse beat a steady rhythm, not of escape, but of reckoning. The saddle creaked softly beneath him, and with every mile, he felt something inside him loosen, like old ropes finally cut free. The faces of the two sisters lingered in his mind, the fury, the forgiveness, the weight of generations laid to rest with just a few trembling words. The land remembers, but it no longer bleeds. He repeated the line under his breath like a prayer. Twilight deepened, and stars began to prick through the horizon, one by one, as if heaven itself had opened its eyes. Clayton rode slower now, his rifle slung behind him, his hat low, his thoughts drifting between past and peace. He thought of all the things he'd buried, friends lost to war, women who never waited, nights when whiskey was the only voice he trusted. The world out here was wide and cruel, but somehow, under this painted sky, it felt forgiving. He followed the river until it split into shallows, the water shimmering in the dying light. He dismounted, crouched down, and dipped his hands into the cool stream. The reflection that stared back wasn't the same man who had ridden in. The lines on his face seemed deeper. Yes, but his eyes were softer, calmer, like the desert had finally let him go. He pulled from his coat pocket a small leather pouch, worn and tied with sinew. Inside it lay a silver spur, old, tarnished, and heavy with meaning. He tossed it into the river, watching the current catch it and carry it away. "For your father," he murmured. The water swallowed it whole, its ripples shining like the breath of forgiveness itself. The wind rose gently, curling around him like a whisper. Somewhere beyond the horizon, coyotes began their mournful songs, and the stars grew brighter, sharper, clearer. Clayton climbed back into the saddle, the night settling around him like a blanket. He didn't know where he was headed, maybe nowhere at all, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel hunted. The ghosts were behind him now, resting in the canyon, and all that lay ahead was the quiet promise of twilight. The desert stretched on forever, endless and soft, and as he rode into the dark, the river followed beside him, murmuring low, as if thanking him for finally listening. Night fell deep and endless over the desert, and the river shone like a thread of silver weaving through the black earth. Clayton Reeves rode slow beneath the stars, each hoofstep a soft echo against the silence. The air had cooled, sweet and sharp, carrying the scent of rain that never came. Somewhere far behind him lay the canyon, sleeping under moonlight, a sacred wound now sealed by forgiveness. Yet, as he rode, the quiet began to feel heavy, as though something unseen walked beside him. He didn't look. He didn't need to. A man whose buried ghosts knows their footsteps. The desert itself seemed to breathe with him, whispering through the sagebrush, stirring the dust, wrapping him in old memories that refused to fade. He saw flashes of his past in the darkness, men shouting by the riverbank, firelight in the eyes of the dying, the bitter sting of gunpowder on his tongue. The faces of the dead rose like smoke, and then vanished again into the night wind. Clayton didn't fight them this time. He just listened. For the first time, the voices weren't angry. They were quiet, watchful, almost grateful. One voice, softer than the rest, spoke above the others, and it made him pull his horse to a stop. "You kept your word." He looked around, but the world was still. The stars above shimmered on the surface of the river, and in that reflection, for a heartbeat, he thought he saw them, the Apache father and son he'd killed long ago, standing on the far bank, faces calm, eyes clear, the younger sister's features faint in their shadows. The image flickered like mist, then drifted away. Clayton bowed his head, his breath shuddering out of him. "I tried," he whispered. "That's all I had left." The wind answered with a sigh that brushed his cheek like a hand. Then, slowly, the weight lifted the ache in his chest, the echo of guilt, the tightness that had lived behind his ribs for a decade. He felt it go, drawn out by the same river that had once carried blood. Now it carried peace. His horse shifted, sensing the stillness, and he gave the reins a gentle tug. "Let's keep moving, boy," he murmured. "We've got ghosts to leave behind." As he rode on, the river followed beside him, its voice softer now, like a hymn hummed by the earth itself. The horizon began to pale, a thin line of gray where dawn was waiting. Behind him, the canyon, the memories, and the dead all slipped back into silence. The desert no longer watched him with suspicion, it watched him with mercy. And for the first time, Clayton Reeves realized that the West wasn't a place to conquer. It was a place that forgave those who finally learned to listen. The first light of morning crept slowly across the horizon, soft as a prayer whispered by the earth itself. The desert glowed in shades of gold and rose, each grain of sand catching the sun like a memory reborn. Clayton Reeves sat tall in the saddle, his hat tipped low, his breath forming faint clouds in the crisp dawn air. The night had been long, a night of ghosts and reckonings, but with the sunrise came something quiet, something clean. He watched the river glisten beside him, no longer silver and ghostly, but warm and alive, moving east like it had stories of its own to tell. For a long while, he just rode without a word, the world around him waking in soft colors, a hawk rising into the wind, a coyote pausing at the ridge, the first hum of insects greeting the day. Clayton smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes not from joy, but from peace. He thought about the sisters, where they might be now, what they might be building among their people, and hoped they'd remember him not as the man who once tested them, but as the one who finally listened. From his coat, he pulled a folded scrap of paper, the last note the elder sister had left for him at the canyon. "If you ever see the dawn, remember, the desert forgives only those who forgive themselves." He read it once more, then tucked it back, eyes glistening in the morning light. The past no longer followed him, it simply existed, far behind, softened by dust and distance. He gave his horse a gentle nudge, and they moved forward together, leaving behind the long shadows of the night. The trail ahead curved toward the mountains, pale and endless, and for the first time, it didn't look lonely. The wind shifted warm, carrying the scent of new life, wet sage, wildflowers, and the faint sound of water running somewhere unseen. Clayton took off his hat, let the sun touch his face, and breathed deep. Somewhere far off, church bells echoed from a town still waking, and he found himself smiling again, wider this time. "Guess it's time to start living," he murmured. The horse snorted softly, as if in agreement. The desert spread out before them, vast and forgiving, the sun climbing higher with every step. As he rode into the golden light, the wind lifted behind him, not chasing, not warning, but blessing, and in that gentle sound, the last of the ghosts finally said goodbye.